The blood on the floor of Sublevel 4 Corridor 9 was the wrong color under red emergency lighting. Ernesto Calixto Vega had been staring at it through the ventilation grate for 11 minutes. He knew it was 11 minutes because he had counted his own breathing. Slow, deliberate, 4 seconds in and 4 seconds out, the way his sergeant had taught him in the tunnel work outside Chihuahua City in 2001, and he had taken approximately 83 breaths, and at his current rate that was 11 minutes, give or take. The blood was Marco's. The Vethrani soldier in the exosuit below did not know Marco's name. He walked his patrol route in a slow, even cadence that Ernesto had already begun to memorize. North wall to the junction, turn, south wall to the coolant access hatch, turn, and his armored boots passed through the edge of the dark stain on each return pass without varying his stride by a single centimeter. It was not cruelty. It was indifference, which, Ernesto had decided, was worse. The red light was not a Vethrani aesthetic choice. Ernesto knew that because he had installed the emergency lighting system on sublevels 3 through 8 himself, 18 months ago, pulling cable through the same shafts he was now lying in. Red meant the main power grid had been manually overridden from the operations center. Red meant whoever was sitting at the bridge console had their hand on the station's spine. Red meant the Vethrani owned the nervous system of Korath Station, which meant they owned everything the station could feel. He had inventoried his tool belt 3 times. Crescent wrench 12-inch, wire strippers, Klein tools, red handles. Voltage tester, non-contact, clipped to his left breast pocket. Tube of pipe thread sealant, half used. Headlamp, Petzl, batteries at roughly 60% based on the brightness. His DeWalt 60V Max angle grinder was not on his belt. It was in his tool locker, sub-level 4, Bay C, 40 meters west of his current position. He had been in the middle of a reclamation pump repair when the breach alarms had sounded, and he had grabbed what was on him and moved. Behind him, pressed against the curve of his spine in the 0.7 meter wide ventilation shaft, Amara made no sound at all. She was 7 years old. She was Cathali, gray-skinned, four-fingered, with eyes the pale gold color of certain kinds of honey, and she had found him in the first 5 minutes of the lockdown, when he was still calculating which route to the emergency shelter would avoid the main corridors. She had come around a corner in a maintenance access way at a dead sprint and collided with his legs, and he had caught her by reflex, and she had looked up at him with her gold eyes and made a sound that he recognized without needing translation, because it was the same sound any child makes when they have been running from something and have found something solid to run to. He had put his finger to his lips. She had not made a sound since. That had been 4 hours ago. She slept sometimes in short intervals, her head against the back of his coveralls. When she slept, she gripped the fabric at his shoulder blade with both four-fingered hands, and even in sleep she did not let go. He did not tell her to. He would not have told her to even if he'd had a reason. He had been trying not to think about Marco. He was not succeeding. Marco Reyes had been 24 years old. He was from Guadalajara originally, though he'd spent most of his teenage years in Monterrey, which was how Ernesto had found him, through the ILC labor registry, which sorted by regional affinity as a default setting, and Ernesto had never bothered to change it because it had never mattered before. He had spent 8 months training Marco, not because the job was complicated. Facilities maintenance on a mid-tier transit station was not, in Ernesto's assessment, the most intellectually demanding profession in the Kethes Compact, but because Marco was the kind of person who, if you gave him context, became 3 times as useful as someone who just followed procedures. He asked questions. He needed to know why the coolant system ran at 340 degrees instead of 300, why the maglock doors had 17 manual override points instead of 1 central panel, why the ventilation shaft dimensions on sublevel 4 were 0.7 meters wide when the rest of the station's shafts ran at 0.5. Ernesto had told him, redundancy. Everything on a space station is built with redundancy, because in space, single points of failure kill everyone. Marco had nodded and written it in his notebook, and 3 weeks later asked a follow-up question that demonstrated he had been thinking about it in the interim. That was the kind of person he was. 5 hours and 40 minutes ago, Ernesto had been in Maintenance Bay C when the breach alarm sounded. He had gone to the nearest ventilation shaft access, Old habit from the engineering days, always know your secondary routes. And he had been working his way toward the emergency shelter on sub-level 3 when he had passed Grate 7 on Corridor 9 and looked down. Marco had been standing in the corridor with 3 other station workers. A Vethrani soldier in full combat exosuit had been saying something in rapid Vethrani that Ernesto could not fully parse, though he caught the word for compliance and the word for movement. One of the other workers, a Thurvani woman, older, had put her hands up immediately. The Vethrani man behind her had gestured with his weapon, and she had walked. Marco had not walked. Marco had said something, in his careful, halting Vethrani, that he had been practicing for 6 months because he said it seemed polite to try, and from the cadence of what he said, Ernesto had understood it was a question, and from the context, hands already beginning to rise, eyes confused and cooperative, no threat in any limb of his body. He had understood it was something simple, something logistical, something that a 24-year-old kid asks when he is frightened and trying to comply, and wants to know what the procedure is. The soldier had shot him, not in warning, not in the leg. Once in the back of the head as Marco was mid-syllable, and Marco had fallen the way objects fall when no instruction reaches the muscles. All at once, without preparation, without the small adjustments that living things make when they descend. And he had not moved again, and the soldier had already turned to the next worker before Marco's body had finished settling. Ernesto had stayed very still. He had not screamed. He had not made a sound. He had pressed his forehead against the cool metal of the ventilation shaft and breathed through his nose and thought about the fact that he had recruited Marco, that he had signed the ILC transfer paperwork, that he had told Marco, explicitly on Marco's second week, be curious, ask questions, never just follow the procedure without understanding why it exists. He could not decide whether that made it his fault. He had been trying to decide for 5 hours. He stopped trying when the maintenance tablet on his belt, still connected to the station's internal network, which the Vethrani had not yet shut down because they did not know it existed. It was a maintenance-only system, unlisted in the standard station manifest, running on a frequency used exclusively by the ILC janitorial and infrastructure staff. Chirped once, softly, with a looped alert. He pulled it from his belt and shielded the screen with his body. Emergency beacon active, Farquharson D. Hydroponics Bay 2, sub-level 5 beacon activation. Time, 1732, station time, current. Time, 2318, station time, beacon. Status, active, no response logged 6 hours old. Desmond was alive, or had been alive 6 hours ago, which was not the same thing but was more than Ernesto had known 30 seconds ago. Hydroponics Bay 2 was 3 levels up and 2 corridors east. It was also, based on the patrol route he had been memorizing for the last 11 minutes, directly adjacent to a path that a 2-soldier Vethrani team walked every 22 minutes. He heard the sound again from below, the soldier's boot passing through the edge of Marco's blood on the return stroke of his patrol. Below the grate, the soldier said something into his comm. Ernesto did not catch all of it, but he caught Vethkali. Soft hands, the Vethrani word for humans, said with the register of a word for furniture, and something that translated approximately as nothing of note. Something in Ernesto Calixto Vega did not decide. It calculated. There is a difference, and he knew the difference, and the difference was that decisions can be reconsidered, but calculations simply arrive at their result and wait for you to act on them. He looked at the tablet. He looked at the grate. He thought briefly and without sentiment about Marco's notebook, the one with the follow-up questions, which was sitting in a drawer in the maintenance bay, and would probably be there when this was over and which no one else would know to look for. Then he began to move. He spent 40 minutes in the ventilation network before he took his first action. 40 minutes of crawling, mapping, counting, listening. He identified 3 patrol teams on sub-levels 4 and 5. Team 1, 2 soldiers, ran a route that covered Corridor 9 and the Eastern Maintenance Junction with a 22-minute cycle. Team 2, also 2 soldiers, covered the Chemical Storage Corridor and the Water Reclamation Approach with an 18-minute cycle, running slightly offset from Team 1, so that there was never a gap in coverage longer than 4 minutes anywhere on the level. Team 3 was on sub-level 5, 2 soldiers, 25-minute cycle, and their route passed directly in front of Hydroponics Bay 2 every revolution. He also identified his tool locker. The locker was in Maintenance Bay C sub-level 4. The nearest patrol, Team 1, passed its door every 22 minutes. The locker required his thumbprint to open, which it would recognize even with one finger missing, because he had enrolled it that way from the start. Inside the locker, his DeWalt 60V max angle grinder, battery fully charged as of this morning's work. A 3M Tech Protection N95 respirator, which he kept for chemical work and had never once used because the chemical work on this station had always been managed properly. A spare voltage tester, 3 batteries for the headlamp, a coil of 12-gauge wire, a box of mixed fasteners. He retrieved the grinder in under 3 minutes, using a 90-second window between Team 1's passes that he had verified twice before moving. He strapped it to his back with the coil of wire and returned to the shaft before the next patrol appeared at the corridor junction. Then he went to work on the problem of Team 1. There was a pressurized coolant access panel in sub-level 4, Corridor 9, Section C, which Team 1 passed on every cycle. The panel covered a junction in the 340-degree coolant line that fed the thermal regulation system for the station's upper reactor. Ernesto had serviced this panel 4 times in 3 years. He knew the torque specification on the access bolts, the thread pitch, and exactly how much pressure was behind the line at any given point in the thermal cycle. He also knew what happened when you cracked a pressurized 340-degree line in an enclosed corridor with 2 Vethrani soldiers whose thermal sensors were calibrated for open-field combat. He did not use the grinder on the access panel itself. The sound would carry too far, and he needed the grinder for something else. He used it on the 4 bolts holding the junction manifold to the secondary line. 90 seconds of cutting that sounded, in the enclosed shaft above, like a very angry cat. He had a 4-minute window. He used 2.5 of them. He cracked the manifold seal by hand, his left hand the one with the missing finger, which gripped the crescent wrench with the full force of a palm that had spent 3 years compensating for what it lacked. Just enough to let pressure build without releasing immediately. Then he moved 15 meters down the shaft to the side access panel he had identified on his mapping pass, slid it open from the inside, and waited in the dark of the wall cavity. He heard Team 1 coming before he saw their lights. He did not watch what happened. He pulled the side access panel closed and listened. There was the sound of 2 sets of armored boots on deck plating, then a sharp hiss as the coolant line pressure found the cracked manifold. Then, from the suits, a sound he could only describe as electronic confusion, the kind of noise a system makes when it receives input outside its calibrated parameters. Then briefly, other sounds, which he categorized and filed away and did not think about further. He counted to 40. Then he opened the side panel. He took 90 seconds in the corridor. He did not take the weapons. The kinetic disruptors were too large and he did not know how to use them safely, and more importantly, he did not need them. He took 1 cracked kinetic shield emitter from the nearest soldier's belt, which he could examine later to understand the shield geometry. He took the communications earpiece from the same soldier's helmet. He was back in the shaft in 90 seconds. Through the earpiece, after a pause of approximately 2 minutes, he heard, "Patrol 7 Keth, confirm status. Thermal anomaly in Sub-4 Corridor 9. Respond." Silence. Then a different voice, unhurried. "Likely sensor malfunction. The Veth-Kelly maintenance systems are poorly calibrated. Log it and dispatch a technical unit. There are no threats on this station worth naming." Ernesto filed 3 things. They were not worried. Their thermal sensors could be blinded by steam. Their radio discipline was sloppy because they expected nothing. He began moving toward Desmond. He took the long route through the water reclamation tunnels, which smelled like minerals and recycled moisture, and were wide enough for him but not for an armored Vethrani exosuit. He was not in a hurry. Hurry was how 24-year-olds moved. Ernesto moved like a man who was fixing something, which was to say, with the patience of someone who understood that doing it wrong the first time cost more than taking the time to do it right. Behind him, Amara moved through the tunnels without making a sound. She had not asked where they were going. He suspected she understood, in the way that children understand things that they do not have words for yet, that the answer was toward someone, and that for now that was enough. The chemical storage bay adjacent to Hydroponics Bay 2 was a room Ernesto knew well. He had done the annual compliance inspection on it 6 months ago, which meant he had personally verified the integrity of every drum, valve, and containment fitting in it, and he knew exactly what it held and in what quantities and in what configuration. The 4 Vethrani soldiers in the corridor outside Hydroponics Bay 2's main door were the problem. They were stationary, not Team 3, which was the mobile patrol. These were guards, posted specifically at the door, which meant someone inside had already tried to get out or make noise, and the Vethrani had responded by posting a permanent presence. That was a change from what he had mapped, and he spent 8 minutes in the storage bay ventilation access, watching through a grate the size of a dinner plate, before he accepted that the 4-soldier configuration was stable and was not going to resolve itself. The storage bay held, among other things, 6 drums of 68% calcium hypochlorite solution, pool-grade chlorine compound, used in the water reclamation system to keep the recycled water biologically inert. The bay also connected via a secondary pipe running along the eastern wall to the ammonia reclamation line that fed the hydroponic system above. Liquid ammonia, NH3, industrial grade, under pressure, temperature controlled. Ernesto had read the material safety data sheets for every chemical in this bay during his first-year orientation, 3 years ago, because that was the kind of person he was, and because the orientation instructor had said reading them was optional, and Ernesto had long ago learned that anything described as optional in a safety context was the most important thing in the room. Ammonia and calcium hypochlorite combined produce chloramine gas. Chloramine gas in sufficient concentration causes immediate severe respiratory distress, chemical burns to mucous membranes, and in a sealed corridor with 4 beings in armored exosuits whose joint seals were rated for ballistic impact, but not for sustained chemical exposure, it would find every gap. He did not mix them directly. He was not, he reminded himself, trying to destroy the station. He was trying to reach a man in a room 20 meters away. He rerouted the ammonia feed line from the hydroponic supply to the corridor's ventilation intake. A straightforward pipe swap that took 9 minutes with the crescent wrench and the channel lock 460 tongue-and-groove pliers he carried in his left thigh pocket. The channel lock was a tool he had owned for 11 years, since his second posting after the Army, and it had done more useful work in those 11 years than most tools did in a lifetime. He set the feed rate to low pressure, then moved to the calcium hypochlorite drums. He did not breach the drum directly into the corridor. He ran it through the same ventilation intake, separated from the ammonia feed by the length of pipe it would take the compound to travel before the 2 streams met in the duct, approximately 90 seconds at current flow rate. He had to estimate this, which he did by calculating the pipe diameter, the pressure differential, and the approximate viscosity of the hypochlorite solution at room temperature, all of which he had memorized from the compliance inspection. He got the respirator from his back pocket. The 3M Tech Protection N95 had never been used. He unfolded it, seated it over his nose and mouth, and pressed the metal nose clip down with his palm. It would not stop chloramine gas completely, and N95 was not rated for chemical warfare agents, but it would filter enough to give him a functional window. He wet a second cloth from the reclamation system's output tap and folded it over the respirator as additional filtration. He sealed the corridor's manual damper from the storage bay side. He waited. The sounds from the corridor lasted 41 seconds by his count. Then they stopped. He waited another 3 minutes, watching the ventilation cycle indicator on the bay's environmental panel, and when the air exchange cycle completed and fresh station air began pulling through the duct, he opened the damper, waited 90 additional seconds, and moved. He breathed through the respirator and the wet cloth and did not breathe through his nose at all, and he did not look at the soldiers longer than necessary to confirm they would not be a problem, and he reached Hydroponics Bay 2's manual access port, a maintenance hatch, not the main door, set in the eastern wall at floor level, in under 40 seconds. He knocked twice, paused, knocked 3 times. The code he and Desmond had established for his Thursday visits, years ago, when Desmond had first started locking the bay during his lunch hour to keep junior staff from stealing his tomatoes. From inside, a scraping sound. Then very close to the hatch, "Ernesto, you beautiful idiot, is it clear?" "Clear enough, can you move?" A pause. "My leg is, yes or no, Des?" "With help." "Okay." He got Desmond out through the maintenance hatch in 4 minutes. Desmond's right leg had a piece of hull shrapnel in the thigh from the initial Vethrani breach explosion. Not arterial, not immediately fatal, but swollen and hot to the touch, and clearly not a thing that was going to walk anywhere on its own initiative. Ernesto got him on his feet using Desmond's arm over his left shoulder, and they moved to the maintenance shaft access in the storage bay, and he got Desmond inside and settled next to Amara, who looked at the large Jamaican man with her gold eyes, and then looked at Ernesto with an expression that said, silently, "You were looking for him." And Ernesto nodded, and she moved closer to Desmond as if she had decided to extend her protection to cover both of them. Desmond looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at Ernesto. Then he said very quietly, "How bad is it out there?" "Don't know the total. Marco's gone." A silence. "I know," Desmond said. "I heard it on the station audio, before they cut the system." He closed his eyes briefly. "How many of them are there?" 40 at least, armed, shielded. I've taken 2 off the count." Desmond looked at him for a long moment, and in his expression Ernesto could see a man doing mathematics he did not want to do. "Ernesto, I need you to stay here with her. I need you to not move and not make any noise." "What are you going to do?" Ernesto picked up the angle grinder and checked the battery indicator. Full charge. He had charged it this morning before the pump repair because he always charged his tools at the start of a shift, because a tool that failed mid-task was a tool that wasted your time, and wasting time was not something Ernesto Calixto Vega had ever been good at tolerating. "I'm going to do my job," he said. He went back out. Through the earpiece, after a long pause, he heard the second transmission. "Commander, we have lost contact with Sub-Level 5 fire team. Environmental sensors show a chemical signature. Possible accidental release. Advise." Another pause, longer. Then the same unhurried voice from before, but with an edge in it now that Ernesto recognized as a man blaming a subordinate for something that had not yet been identified as not the subordinate's fault. "Accidental. These humans cannot even maintain their own atmosphere. Send a hazmat unit. And tell Patrol Leader Veth Akas that if he has allowed his soldiers to be incapacitated by a pipe failure, he will answer to me personally." The hazmat unit would come down from Sub-Level 3. He had approximately 14 minutes before they reached the Sub-Level 5 main corridor junction. There was a water reclamation turbine room 30 meters east of the chemical storage bay. 3 active turbines running 24/7, processing recycled water from the station's domestic systems. Ernesto had serviced all 3 turbines within the last 4 months. He knew that Turbine 2's impeller housing safety lockout, a magnetic interlock that prevented the housing from being opened while the impeller was spinning, could be defeated by applying 12 volts directly to the interlock solenoid from the external service panel, bypassing the safety circuit. This was not a procedure documented in any manual. It was a procedure he had developed himself after the 3rd time the official lockout had malfunctioned during a scheduled maintenance window, and he had needed to open the housing anyway. He also knew that the turbine room's floor drainage system, normally set to run excess water to the reclamation tanks, could be rerouted to the emergency flood drains, which emptied to the corridor outside, not to any tank. By turning a single red-handled valve on the southern wall. He had turned that valve twice in 3 years, both times during flood control drills. He knew exactly what happened when he turned it. He knew that the electrical relay junction for sub-levels 4 through 7 was inside the turbine room, on the north wall, behind a panel rated for 480 volts. He knew that the turbine room itself was Faraday shielded, standard practice for any room with high-voltage electrical equipment near sensitive water systems, which meant that anything inside the room was electrically isolated from anything outside it, including the communications earpiece in his ear. He had 8 minutes when he reached the turbine room. He used 3 of them to set the valve, start the floor drainage to the corridor, and wait for 12 centimeters of water to accumulate in the corridor outside. Enough to create a complete circuit, not enough to drain back under the door seal. He used 2 more minutes to pull the relay panel cover with the channel lock, identify the main feed, and position himself with the bare end of his 12-gauge wire coil, touching the feed terminal from the insulated interior of the service cavity. He spent the remaining 3 minutes listening through the grate in the turbine room door as the hazmat unit's boots approached through the water. He threw the relay. The sound was very large. Then there was no sound at all from outside the turbine room. Then he heard his own heartbeat, which was very loud, and he waited for it to slow down, and it did not slow down very much. He heard the Vethrani radio go to static, then silence. Then, after a long time, long enough that he had begun to wonder if the earpiece had also been affected despite the Faraday shielding, which would mean he was now operating blind, the voice again. The same voice from before, but different now. Not the blame voice. A different register entirely. The voice of a man who has revised a calculation and does not like the new result. All units, sub-level 5 has gone dark. We have lost 8 soldiers. I want a full combat company in the maintenance section now. Whatever is down there, it is not accidental. Ernesto came out of the turbine room through the interior access port, into the sub-level 5 secondary maintenance corridor. The 9th soldier came around the corner from the north. He was not part of the hazmat unit. He was running silent. No radioactive, no thermal indicator lit on his exosuit's external display, which meant he had been operating in a surveillance posture, not a contact posture. A scout. Sent ahead, perhaps, when the first 2 soldiers had failed to report. Or perhaps sent independently, by the kind of careful commander who sends scouts when he is not certain what his patrols are walking into. The soldier saw Ernesto at the same moment Ernesto saw the soldier. The kinetic round went through Ernesto's right shoulder. He felt it enter and exit, and both events were very loud and very specific, and the deltoid muscle and the shoulder joint that held his right arm to the rest of him informed him, with great clarity, that they were no longer in a functional configuration. He hit the soldier with the angle grinder in his left hand. He did not think about what he was doing. The grinder weighed 2.4 kilograms with the battery, which was enough, and his left hand, the hand that had been compensating for a missing finger for 3 years, the hand that gripped with the whole of its palm because it had learned that a full palm grip was stronger than any 2 fingers, held on. He leaned against the corridor wall afterward. He did not sit down. Sitting down was a thing you did when you were finished, and he was not finished. The shoulder made itself known to him in waves, each wave slightly larger than the previous one, and he understood this was the adrenaline working. His blood carrying cortisol in concentrations that were shutting down the C-fiber nerve pathways that would otherwise be telling him to stop, the same mechanism that had let soldiers walk on fractured tibias in the Chihuahua tunnel work, the same mechanism that was now spiking his blood pressure to compensate for what was leaking from the entry wound. He was not brave. His body had simply made an executive decision that dying was a secondary priority and had routed resources accordingly. He thought for just a moment about the Monterey steel mills at night, the smell of them from his mother's apartment window, sulfur and something almost sweet underneath it, the smell of metal being remade. He had always found it reassuring. He found the smell of the chloramine residue in the corridor faintly reassuring now, for the same reason his brain found familiar in the wrong places when it was working hard. He had one thing left to do before the full company arrived. He could not fight 40 soldiers. But he had known from the beginning that he did not need to fight them. He was a maintenance technician. He did not fight structures. He controlled them. The maglock blast doors on sublevels 4 through 7 were rated to withstand 4,000 pounds of ballistic impact. They had been installed, Ernesto had been told during his station orientation, because the ILC's insurance carrier required them, and because the station's designers had correctly understood that in the event of a hull breach or hostile boarding, the ability to seal off the station's industrial core was worth more than whatever it cost to install the doors. Each door had a manual override panel. There were 17 panels across sublevels 4 through 7. Each panel required a physical key, a hex wrench, 6mm, standard ILC maintenance issue, and a 7-digit code entered on a mechanical number wheel, not an electronic keypad, because the designers had also understood that electronic systems could be hacked or powered down. The 7-digit codes were different for each panel, and were documented only in the ILC facility's maintenance manual, a physical document kept in the maintenance bay and cross-memorized by the senior facilities maintenance technician as a condition of employment. Ernesto had memorized all 17 codes on his second week. He moved through the station's maintenance spine with his right arm hanging and his left arm working, and he turned 17 hex bolts and entered 17 7-digit codes in 17 locations spread across 4 sublevels, and when he reached the 17th panel and turned the final bolt, he heard, from somewhere above in the main corridor network, the sound of armored boots arriving at a sealed blast door and finding it sealed. He leaned his forehead against the panel for 4 seconds, then he straightened. He found the maintenance shaft where he had left Amara and Desmond. Amara was awake, sitting with her back against the shaft wall, watching the access hatch. When he came through, she looked at his right arm, and then at his face, and she reached out and took hold of his left hand with both of hers. He let her. Desmond looked at the shoulder and opened his mouth. "Don't," Ernesto said. "I'm a hydroponics engineer, not a doctor. I wasn't going to offer medical advice." "Good. I was going to ask if you got all the blast doors." 17. Desmond was quiet for a moment. "How long can they hold?" "For a maintenance crew with the codes and the hex wrenches, 4 hours minimum. They don't have the codes. They don't have the wrenches. They'd have to cut through." He paused. "The doors are rated to 4,000 pounds ballistic." Desmond looked at him for a long time. Then he said softly, "You planned this." "I planned the locking. The rest I worked out as I went." He settled against the shaft wall, and the shaft wall held him up, which was what he needed it to do. "Desmond, did you get an emergency code out before your beacon died?" A pause. "Yes. Backup frequency. Compact response channel." "How long ago?" "About 6 hours. Same time I triggered the beacon." Ernesto did the math. Compact rapid response protocol was a 4 to 6 hour deployment window from the nearest staging point, which was Kethis Hub 2, approximately 3.8 light hours from Korath Station. 6 hours was within range. "Okay," he said. He closed his eyes. Not because he was sleeping, he was not going to sleep, but because the headlamp battery was at 30% now, and he wanted to conserve it, and because his right shoulder had begun to communicate with him in a register beyond what the adrenaline could fully suppress, and it was easier to receive that communication with his eyes closed. Amara did not let go of his hand. He did not ask her to. 22 minutes later, he heard the sounds above him shift. Heavy equipment, multiple points of entry, the specific percussion of armored compact response units moving fast through a station they did not know. He heard Vethrani communications on his earpiece, clipped and urgent, and then he heard something he had not heard in any Vethrani voice in the last several hours. Uncertainty. He heard the blast doors holding. 31 minutes after that, a compact response unit cut through the sub-level 4 maintenance shaft access from above, and a light that was not red swept through the tunnel, and a voice in Cathali said, "Confirm life signs. We have 3, 1 critical." Amara said something. The first words she had spoken in over 4 hours. Ernesto did not speak Cathali well enough to catch it, but from the way the response unit soldier stopped moving and was quiet for a moment before continuing, he thought it was probably something important. He looked at Desmond. "Thursday's still on, Des," he said. Then the ceiling came up to meet him, which he understood was actually the floor, and he decided not to worry about which one it was. Commander Voss of the Cathali Compact Rapid Response Corps had been a soldier for 31 years. He had served in 4 armed engagements, 2 of them classified, and he had walked through the aftermath of violence often enough to have developed what he privately thought of as a correct relationship with it. Not indifference, not immunity, but a functional capacity to observe and process without being incapacitated by what he observed. He walked through sub-levels 4 through 7 of Korath Station for 2 hours after securing the facility and disarming the 40 Vethrani soldiers who had found themselves trapped above the blast door line, unable to advance, and increasingly reluctant to explain why. He started at Corridor 9, Sublevel 4, where the blood on the floor was old enough to have partially dried. He followed the scorch marks on the coolant access panel to the pressure junction, and he found the manifold, and he understood immediately what had been done and how and with what tool, because the tool had been left behind. A DeWalt angle grinder, set neatly against the corridor wall, as if someone had put it down because they needed both hands for something else, and intended to pick it up again. He followed the evidence south and east. He found the chemical storage bay. He read the pipe configuration with the help of his engineering adjutant and understood what had been rerouted and why. And his adjutant said something technical about the ammonia hypochlorite reaction that Voss already knew and did not need explained. And he told the adjutant to be quiet, which the adjutant was. He found the turbine room. He found the relay panel. He found the red-handled valve. He found the residual water level in the corridor outside, which had mostly drained in the time since the event, but not completely. He found the 9 locations where Vethrani soldiers had been removed from the engagement by methods that the evidence, examined carefully, attributed to a single set of boot prints. Standard ILC maintenance footwear, size 43, moving at a pace his forensic specialist estimated as unhurried. He stood in the sub-level 5 corridor for a long time without saying anything. His adjutant said, "Sir, the casualty count is confirmed at—" "I know the count," Voss said. "Yes, sir." He looked at the boot prints. He looked at the blast door at the end of the corridor, sealed, holding, with scratches on its surface consistent with a combat unit attempting to breach it with inadequate tools. He looked at the general shape of the thing he was standing inside. "One," he said in Cathali. "This was done by one." His adjutant said nothing. There was nothing useful to add. In the compact medical station at Korath's upper ring, the field physician Dr. Esselith of the Thervani Medical Corps dictated into her recorder in the careful, precise voice she used when she was not certain her documentation would be believed. Subject is a human male, Ernesto Calixto Vega, 47 years of age. Presenting injuries include a full-thickness projectile wound to the right deltoid with clean entry and exit, traumatic right shoulder dislocation, and estimated blood volume loss of 31%, which places the subject at Class 3 hemorrhagic shock by standard Cathali physiological classification. Core temperature is 39.4 degrees. Resting heart rate is 187 beats per minute, consistent with sustained adrenal activation at extreme levels. The subject has not lost consciousness from the time of his injuries to the time of extraction, a period I am estimating at approximately 4 hours based on the event timeline, and he sustained activity consistent with significant physical exertion throughout that period. Any Cathali subject presenting with these parameters would have entered hypovolemic circulatory collapse within 8 to 12 minutes of reaching 31% blood volume loss. I have no current physiological model that explains why this subject is alive or how he remained functionally active for 4 hours post-injury. I am beginning to suspect the model is the problem. She paused the recorder. She looked at the subject through the observation window of the treatment bay. He was sedated now, with his right shoulder immobilized and his blood volume being restored through 2 simultaneous IV lines, the Thervani standard treatment for severe hemorrhage, which she hoped was compatible with human physiology, and which her emergency database suggested it was mostly. In the chair beside his bed, a small gray-skinned Cathali girl was asleep with her head on a folded pair of coveralls. The girl had refused to leave the room. Dr. Esselith had not tried very hard to make her. She resumed the recorder. Personal note not for official documentation. I have seen soldiers. I have treated them, and I have reviewed their files. And I know what soldiers look like when they have been in combat. This man does not look like a soldier. He looks like a man who fixed something that was broken and got hurt doing it, and is sleeping now because the job is done. I find this more unsettling than I expected to. She stopped the recorder. 9 days later, the ceiling was the wrong color. Ernesto lay on his back in the compact medical station and looked at the off-white ceiling and understood that his brain had spent 9 days defaulting to the expectation of red, and that the absence of red was something it needed to be reminded of. He spent a few seconds doing this reminding. Then he looked at the chair beside his bed. Amara was asleep in it. She had his coveralls, his last spare pair, the ones he kept folded in his locker for inspection days, which someone must have retrieved and brought here, folded into a rough pillow shape, and her head was on them, and her four-fingered hands were loose in her lap. He looked at her for a while. Then he looked at the IV in his left arm, the immobilizer brace on his right shoulder, the medical equipment around him that was mostly alien in design, but interpretable by function. He thought about Marco's notebook. He wondered if someone had gotten it out of the maintenance bay. A Thurvani medical technician appeared in the doorway, took one look at his open eyes, and disappeared to find someone more qualified. Dr. Eselith arrived 3 minutes later, confirmed he was alive and functional, and told him what had happened in the 9 days he had been unconscious. The Vithrani Enforcement Directorate had, upon the failure of their operation and the capture of their strike force, pivoted immediately to a legal and diplomatic posture. Executor Prath, the Directorate's liaison to the Compact Council, had filed a formal complaint within 18 hours. Ernesto's actions constituted an unauthorized armed engagement by non-combatant labor auxiliary personnel in violation of Compact civilian non-escalation protocols. The incident should be reclassified. The security footage from Korath Station's internal camera system, which had captured in considerable detail approximately 4 hours of one maintenance technician's systematic engagement with a 40-person combat force, should be suppressed pending review. Prath's argument was structurally elegant, Eselith told him, and Ernesto could see that she found this distasteful in the way that a doctor finds distasteful the correct diagnosis of something she wishes were not happening. If humans were non-combatant labor auxiliary, then what Ernesto did was illegal. If it was legal, then humans were combatants, and the Compact's classification of 4.2 million human workers would need to be revised. Either way, the Compact needed to act. Either way, the footage stayed suppressed. Ernesto listened to all of this. Then he asked Eselith for his coveralls. She looked at the ones in the chair, still serving as Amara's pillow. Those ones? I have another pair, he said. Inspection ones. He walked into the Compact Council chamber on the 9th day wearing his inspection coveralls. Clean, pressed along the seams the way he pressed them before an ILC compliance review, with the ILC patch on the left shoulder and his name tag in the standard position. His right arm was in a sling. There was a healing burn across his left cheekbone, and he moved slowly because the shoulder was still not interested in being moved quickly. He sat down in the witness chair without being invited to, which produced a brief silence from the assembled council members, and he folded his left hand on the table in front of him and waited. Executor Prath was exactly what Ernesto had expected from 9 days of description. Thin, precise, the kind of official who selected words the way engineers selected fasteners, the exact specification for the exact load, no substitutions. He opened his statement with the legal framework. He cited the non-escalation protocol. He cited the Labor Auxiliary Classification Code. He was organized and thorough, and he did not waste words. When he finished, the council's chair, a Thurvani elder named Magistrate Orath, asked Ernesto to respond to the characterization of his actions. Ernesto said, "They shot Marco, he was 24. He asked where the bathroom was. Executor Prath said that this did not constitute legal authorization for—" "I know," Ernesto said, not cutting him off, waiting for a natural pause and speaking into it. "I didn't do it legally. I did it because there was a child behind me in a ventilation shaft and a man bleeding in a room, and I'm a combat engineer, and the only thing I've ever been good at is knowing how a structure fails." A council member from the Vithrani Observer delegation, not Prath, someone younger, asked if he had been afraid. He thought about it. Not as a rhetorical device, he actually thought about it, running through the sequence of events the way he would run through a maintenance log, looking for the moments when fear had been the operative variable. "I was afraid he'd already gotten to Desmond," he said. The council chamber was quiet for a moment. Magistrate Orath asked him to explain, for the record, the technical methods he had used during the Korath incident. He explained them. He explained them the way he would explain a maintenance procedure to a junior technician. starting with the problem, proceeding to the available resources, describing the applied solution in sequence. He used the words ammonia reclamation line and calcium hypochlorite and 480-volt relay junction and 17 manual override panels, and he described the decisions he had made and the reasons he had made them, and none of it sounded even to him like warfare. It sounded like a very bad shift. When he finished, Executor Prath delivered his closing statement. His position was unchanged. Going forward, he proposed, the compact should consider restricting human labor auxiliary personnel from access to station infrastructure systems, chemical stores, maintenance equipment, and structural override panels. This was, he said, a reasonable precautionary measure. Ernesto waited for him to finish. He had been trying to identify for the last 9 days the exact thing he wanted to say at this moment, and he had not identified it until approximately 3 minutes ago, when he had been walking through the council building's outer corridor and had passed a wall display showing the standard compact labor statistics, the rolling numbers, updated quarterly, of how many beings were employed in what capacities across the 31-member species. The number for human labor auxiliary, as of the last quarterly update, was 4,200,000. He said quietly, "You're not wrong that it's a risk." He paused. "You should probably also know that there are 4.2 million humans currently employed in maintenance, sanitation, and infrastructure roles across compact stations. Every one of them knows how those stations fail. I'd think carefully about whether making them feel unsafe is the policy you want." He did not raise his voice. He did not lean forward. He said it at the same register he used when he was explaining to a junior technician why you checked the torque on a coolant line fitting before you walked away from it. Not threatening, not performing. Just the fact, delivered with the weight of someone who understood exactly what the fact meant. Executor Prath was still. Then he shuffled his papers. It was the first thing he had done in the entire proceeding that had not been prepared in advance. His hands arranged the papers into a configuration that was identical to how they had been before, which meant the shuffling was not organizational. It was something else. In the public gallery, Commander Voss, seated in the 3rd row, noticed. He filed it away in the place where he kept things he would think about later. Magistrate Orith recessed the session. Desmond was in the outer corridor, leaning on crutches with his leg still wrapped and his grin going from one ear to the other. "You missed Thursday," he said. "I was busy. Twice. Still busy." Desmond reached into his jacket pocket and produced a travel domino set, the small magnetic kind ILC issue, the kind sold in every station commissary in the compact, which Desmond had told him once was an insult to the game but which was perfectly functional and took up almost no space. He held it up. Ernesto looked at it. Then he looked at the bench along the corridor wall. Then he sat down on it, carefully, because the shoulder was still making its opinions known, and Desmond settled beside him on his crutches, and they set up the dominoes on the bench between them, and they played. They played for 45 minutes while the compact council machinery ground on inside the chamber, and the species of the Kethys Compact's 31-member coalition debated the question of what to do about the security footage and the humans and the incident at Korith Station, and Desmond won 3 games and Ernesto won 2, and the third was a draw, which Desmond contested on procedural grounds that Ernesto did not accept. Amara found them at the 30-minute mark. She had come from the medical station with a compact administrator who looked like she was professionally uncertain about the situation, but was managing it with dignity. Amara sat down on Ernesto's right side, his sling side, and leaned against his arm without touching the injury, with the careful spatial awareness of someone who had spent time in ventilation shafts, learning to be precise about where her body was. She watched the dominoes. After a few minutes, she pointed at a tile. "That one," Ernesto said in the direction of Desmond. Desmond considered the tile. "She's right," he said, and played it. 3 weeks later, a journalist from the Compact Newsfeed service, a young Cathali woman named Veth Sarah, who had been covering the Korith incident since the footage was finally officially released to the public over Executor Prath's formal objection, found Ernesto in the rebuilt Hydroponics Bay 2 on Sublevel 5. He was sitting on an upturned crate beside Desmond's workbench. His right arm was still in a partial brace, but the sling was gone, which the journalist noted as an improvement from the council chamber footage that had been circulating across the compact's news networks for 2 weeks. Amara was nearby, examining a seedling tray with the focused attention of someone learning a new system. The journalist asked after the standard biographical questions and the timeline questions, and the technical questions that Ernesto answered with the same maintenance log precision he brought to everything, what he wanted people to understand about what had happened at Corinth Station. He was quiet for a moment. He thought about Marco's notebook, which had been recovered from the maintenance bay, and which was now in Ernesto's possession, because when you train someone and they die, their notebooks belong to the person who taught them to take notes. He thought about Amara sleeping on his coveralls in a hospital chair. He thought about the 45 minutes of dominoes in the council corridor, and the way Desmond's grin had looked after 2 weeks of surviving on crackers and reclamation water. He thought about something that was not quite a memory and not quite a philosophy, more like a standing operational principle that he had never articulated before because it had never needed articulation. The principle that a station is a structure, and a structure has failure points, and failure points are not the enemy. Failure points are information, and if you know where the information is, you can work with it. He thought about the fact that he had been fixing things his whole life. Tunnels in the army, pipes on this station, relationships that needed maintenance the way all systems do. He had been fixing things since before he knew that was what he was doing, and he would be fixing things after this was over because that was the job, and the job did not stop because someone had shot Marco. He looked at Desmond, who was at the workbench with his back turned, carefully transplanting a seedling into a grow medium tray, moving with the deliberate precision of a man who understood that living systems required attention. Then he looked at Amara, who was still examining the seedlings with her gold eyes, and who had spoken more words in the last 3 weeks than in the first 9 days, and who was going to require considerable attention herself, and who had apparently decided that Ernesto Calixto Vega was the correct structure to anchor that attention to, which was a responsibility he had not asked for and did not intend to fail. Desmond turned from the workbench and held something out to Amara. A small tomato, red-orange, the size of a marble, grown from a seed in a station that had been occupied by 40 armed soldiers 3 weeks ago and was now, again, growing things. Amara took it in both four-fingered hands and held it carefully, the way she held everything she had decided mattered. The journalist was waiting. "We're maintenance," Ernesto said. "We fix what's broken. Sometimes what's broken is the situation." He picked up his crescent wrench from the bench beside him, 12-inch, still slightly carbon-scored from the relay junction, and went back to work.